You're listening to Scary Sleep Stories presents The Dark Hours.
Welcome, guys. I know a lot of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before you drift off like the video, subscribe if you're new, and comment what time it is right now. Let's see who's still awake and who's not alone tonight. Let's begin.
The headlights of my old Chevy cut through the inky darkness, illuminating an endless ribbon of asphalt stretching towards the horizon. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the empty highway lulling me into a trance-like state. The radio had long since faded to static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the hypnotic hum of tires on pavement. I glanced at the glowing green numbers on my dashboard clock, 2:37 a.m. Still a long way to go before I reached my sister's place in Tucson. I'd promised to help her move, but now I was regretting my decision to drive through the night. My eyelids felt heavy, and I fumbled for my lukewarm coffee in the cup holder. As I took a sip of the bitter liquid, a flicker of movement in my rearview mirror caught my attention. Headlights appeared in the distance behind me, growing larger as they approached. I felt a mixture of relief and unease. On one hand, it was comforting to know I wasn't completely alone out here in the middle of nowhere. But something about the way the car was rapidly closing the gap between us sent a shiver down my spine. Within minutes, the vehicle was right on my bumper. I squinted into the mirror, trying to make out any details, but all I could see was a dark silhouette in the glare of headlights. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I waited for them to pass. The highway was wide open. There was no reason for them to tailgate like this, but they didn't pass. The car matched my speed exactly, staying mere feet from my rear bumper. I tapped my brakes, hoping they'd take the hint and back off. Instead, they seemed to inch even closer. My heart began to race. This wasn't normal behavior. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my old car faster. The speedometer crept up, 70, 75, 80 miles per hour. The car behind me kept pace effortlessly. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, my palms growing sweaty. "What the hell do you want?" I muttered, glancing nervously between the road ahead and my rearview mirror. After a few more minutes of this nerve-wracking pursuit, I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest area. My gas tank was still nearly full, but I decided to pull over anyway. Maybe this weirdo would just pass me by if I got off the road. I flicked on my turn signal and began to decelerate. To my surprise and relief, the headlights behind me dimmed as the car slowed down too. As I pulled into the rest area and found a parking spot, I watched the other vehicle continue down the highway, quickly disappearing into the darkness. I let out a long exhale, realizing I'd been holding my breath. "Get it together," I told myself, shaking my head. "You're letting your imagination run wild." The rest area was deserted. Just a small building with restrooms and vending machines surrounded by a few picnic tables. I stepped out of my car, stretching my legs and breathing in the cool night air. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise, no insects chirping, not even a breeze rustling the scraggly trees dotting the landscape. I headed for the restroom, fishing some change out of my pocket for the vending machines. As I pushed open the heavy metal door, the fluorescent lights flickered to life, humming faintly. I winced at my reflection in the grimy mirror, bloodshot eyes and stubble shadowing my jaw. I splashed some cold water on my face, trying to wake myself up. When I emerged a few minutes later, clutching a bag of stale chips and a bottle of water, I froze in my tracks. There, parked right next to my Chevy, was a car I hadn't noticed before. It was hard to make out many details in the dim lighting, but it looked remarkably similar to the one that had been tailing me. My breath caught in my throat as I approached cautiously. The car was empty, its windows tinted too darkly to see inside clearly. I did a quick scan of the rest area, but there was no sign of the driver. A gust of wind sent a discarded paper bag skittering across the pavement, making me jump. Get a grip, I thought. It's probably just another traveler who pulled in after you. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I hurried back to my car, fumbling with my keys. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. My head snapped around, but there was nothing there, just shadows and stillness. With shaking hands, I started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, gravel crunching under my tires. In my rearview mirror, I saw headlights flare to life. The other car was pulling out behind me. No, 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 I muttered, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. This couldn't be happening. I accelerated hard, the engine of my old Chevy protesting as I pushed it to its limits. The headlights stayed right with me, neither gaining nor losing ground. Miles of empty highway flew by as I tried to put distance between us. My mind raced through possible explanations and options. Should I try to call for help? My cell phone was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it before leaving. Could I outlast them? Eventually they'd need to stop for gas, right? Just as I was considering attempting some evasive maneuvers I'd seen in movies, a new set of headlights appeared on the horizon ahead of me. Relief flooded through me. Another car, a witness, maybe even help. As the approaching vehicle drew closer, I flashed my headlights desperately, trying to signal that something was wrong. But the car didn't slow down. It blazed past me at high speed, and in the brief moment it was alongside me, I caught a glimpse of the driver. The car was empty. I let out a strangled gasp, nearly swerving off the road in shock. That was impossible. I must not have seen correctly in the split second the car passed. But a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach as I replayed the image in my mind. There had been no one behind the wheel. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The car that had been following me was still there, keeping pace. But now, it was joined by the car that had passed me. Both sets of headlights glared in my mirror, perfectly aligned. I was trapped between them. Panic clawed at my throat. This couldn't be real. I was hallucinating. I had to be. The lack of sleep, the stress of the long drive. It was all catching up to me. I shook my head violently, trying to clear it. When I looked back at the road, my blood ran cold. Ahead of me, more headlights were appearing. First, just a few pairs, then dozens, all speeding towards me. As they drew closer, I could see that every single vehicle was empty, driver's seats vacant, yet moving with precision. I was surrounded on all sides by a convoy of ghost cars. My breath came in ragged gasps as I searched desperately for an escape route, but the phantom vehicles had formed an impenetrable wall around me. No matter which way I swerved, they moved to block my path. Suddenly, all of the cars began to slow down in unison. I found my own speed dropping, as if my car was being controlled by an unseen force. We came to a stop in the middle of the highway, my vehicle at the center of a circle of silent, driverless cars. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sound was my own panicked breathing and the ticking of my engine as it cooled. Then, one by one, the doors of the surrounding cars began to open. Dark figures emerged from each vehicle, humanoid shapes, but wrong somehow. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding rather than walking. As they drew closer, I could see that their bodies seemed to be made of swirling shadows, constantly shifting and reforming. I scrambled to lock my doors, but my trembling fingers couldn't seem to find the button. One of the shadow figures reached my car and placed a hand on the window. Where it touched, frost spread across the glass in intricate patterns. The temperature inside my car plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me as I shrank back against the seat, as far from the window as I could get. The shadow being leaned in close, its featureless face inches from mine, separated only by the thin barrier of glass. And then, impossibly, it began to push through. The glass rippled like water as the figure's head and shoulders emerged into my car. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow creature reached for me with hands made of darkness. Just as its cold fingers brushed my skin, a blaring horn jolted me awake. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding. I was in my car, pulled over on the shoulder of the highway. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and a semi-truck roared past, the driver giving me an irritated look. It took me several minutes to get my bearings. I must have pulled over at some point during the night, too tired to continue. The terrifying journey had all been a dream. I scrubbed my hands over my face, trying to shake off the lingering dread from the nightmare. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I reached for the key to restart my car. My hand froze. There, on the passenger seat next to me, was a single black feather. As I watched, it crumbled to ash and blew away on a phantom breeze. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat and trying to convince myself that I was truly awake. Eventually, I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that just beyond my peripheral vision, shadows were moving, and somewhere in my rearview mirror, phantom headlights were gaining ground. The scream that echoed across our farm that night wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something in between, a sound that made my blood run cold and my hair stand on end. I'd heard all manner of noises growing up on this land, the low bellow of cattle, the shrill cries of hawks, even the occasional mountain lion's screech. But this was different, and it was coming from the old silo. I'm Jim Hawkins, third-generation owner of Hawkins Family Farm. We're not a big operation, just a modest spread of cornfields and cattle pastures nestled in the rolling hills of rural Ohio. The farm's been in my family for nearly a century, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and now to me. I know every inch of this land like the back of my hand, or at least, I thought I did. The night everything changed started like any other. I'd finished my evening chores, fed the livestock, and was looking forward to a cold beer and some mindless TV before bed. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A warm breeze rustled through the cornfields, carrying the earthy scent of late summer. I was halfway to the house when I heard it, that bone-chilling cry piercing the twilight. I froze, my work boots rooted to the dusty path. For a moment, I thought I must have imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable. My first instinct was to run, either away from the sound or towards the house to call for help. But something held me in place. Curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe just the ingrained responsibility of being the man of the farm. Whatever it was, I found myself turning towards the old silo instead of away from it. The silo loomed against the darkening sky, a hulking cylinder of corroded metal that hadn't been used in years. It was the oldest structure on the property, built by my grandfather in the 1930s. We'd switched to more modern grain storage decades ago, and the silo had stood empty ever since, a silent sentinel at the edge of the cornfields. As I approached, my footsteps crunching on gravel, an eerie silence fell over the farm. No crickets chirping, no distant lowing of cattle, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the thudding of my heart in my ears. The silo's rusted door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I hesitated, suddenly aware of how foolish this was. I had no weapon, no flashlight, nothing but my own two hands and a stubborn need to know what was going on in my own backyard. I pushed the door open wider, wincing at the screech of metal on metal. The interior was pitch black, the fading twilight unable to penetrate the silo's depths. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, cursing under my breath when I realized I'd left it charging in the house. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone in here?" Silence. I took a tentative step inside, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The air was thick with the musty smell of old grain and something else, something sharp and acrid that made my nose wrinkle. As my vision slowly cleared, I began to make out shapes in the gloom. The concrete floor was littered with debris, old pieces of machinery, empty feed bags, rusted tools. But something else caught my eye, something that didn't belong. Scratches, deep, jagged grooves carved into the metal walls of the silo. They started near the floor and ran upwards, some as high as I could see in the dim light. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What could have made marks like that? And why? I ran my hand over one of the scratches, feeling the roughness under my calloused fingers. Whatever had done this had been powerful and desperate. A sound from above made me jerk my hand back. It was faint, barely audible, a scraping noise, like something moving against metal. I tilted my head back, squinting into the darkness overhead. That's when I saw it. A ladder, running up the side of the silo all the way to the top. It was old, the metal rungs coated with rust, but it looked sturdy enough. And at the top, was that a flicker of movement? Before I could talk myself out of it, I was climbing. The rungs were cold under my hands, flakes of rust coming off on my palms. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run from this place and never look back. But something drove me upward, a need to know that overpowered my fear. I was about halfway up when I heard the noise again, that inhuman cry that had first drawn me here. It was louder now, coming from directly above me. I froze, clinging to the ladder, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. For a long moment I stayed there, paralyzed between fear and curiosity. Then, slowly, I began to climb again, one rung at a time, my breathing ragged in the stillness of the silo. As I neared the top, a new sound reached my ears. A low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged across metal. It was coming from the very top of the silo, just out of sight. I reached the final rung, my arms trembling with exertion and fear. Taking a deep breath, I poked my head up through the opening at the top of the ladder. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. The top of the silo was bathed in pale moonlight streaming through the open roof hatch. And there, in the center of the circular space, was something. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but larger, much larger. Its skin was a mottled gray, hanging in loose folds over a skeletal frame. Long, spindly limbs ended in claws that scraped against the metal floor with each movement, creating the dragging sound I'd heard. But it was the creature's face that made my blood run cold. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, opened wide in a silent scream. For a moment, we stared at each other, me, frozen in horror, and the creature, its eyeless gaze somehow fixed directly on me. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should be able to move, lunging towards me with impossible speed. I reacted on pure instinct, releasing my grip on the ladder and letting myself fall. The world spun around me as I plummeted through darkness. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Pain shot through my body, but adrenaline pushed me to my feet. I stumbled towards the silo door, my vision blurry, ears ringing. Behind me, I could hear the creature descending, its claws screeching against metal as it climbed down the ladder with inhuman agility. I burst out of the silo, gasping in the cool night air. Without looking back, I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, across the fields, towards the safety of the farmhouse. The sound of pursuit faded behind me, but I didn't slow down until I'd slammed and locked the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bedroom, every light in the house blazing, a loaded shotgun across my lap. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. The farm was quiet, peaceful in the early morning light. No sign of the horror I'd encountered. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But I knew better. I called the sheriff that morning, trying to explain what I'd seen without sounding like a complete lunatic. To his credit, he listened patiently, then promised to send a deputy out to take a look around. They found nothing, of course. No creature, no scratches on the silo walls. The deputy gave me a look that was equal parts pity and suspicion, clearly thinking I was either crazy or pulling some kind of prank. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, hiding in the darkness of that old silo. And every night since, As the sun dips below the horizon, I find myself staring out at that rusted cylinder, watching for any sign of movement. Because deep down, I know the truth. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. And someday, it will be back. The farm's been in my family for generations. This land is in my blood. But now, for the first time in my life, I'm thinking of selling. Of packing up and leaving this place behind, because some things once seen can't be unseen, and some horrors once awakened can never truly be put back to sleep. The moment I saw those blood-stained hands, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. But by then, it was already too late. The sun was setting, my phone was dead, and I was stranded on a lonely stretch of road with a stranger whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It had all started so innocently. Just another long drive on my cross-country road trip. The kind of journey I'd dreamed about since I was a kid. Me, my beat-up Honda Civic, and the open road. Freedom, adventure, and the promise of new horizons. I'm Sarah, 28 years old, and finally taking that gap year I never got around to after college. 5 years of grinding away in a cubicle had left me feeling hollow, unfulfilled. So I'd quit my job, sold most of my stuff, and hit the road. No real destination in mind, just a vague plan to head west and see where the wind took me. For the first few weeks, it had been everything I'd hoped for. Stunning vistas, quirky roadside attractions, late nights around campfires with fellow travelers. I'd felt more alive than I had in years. But as I pushed deeper into the heartland, the romance of the road started to wear thin. Long stretches of monotonous highway, endless fields of corn and wheat. The novelty of gas station coffee and greasy diner food had long since faded. So when my car started making an ominous rattling noise somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, my heart sank. I'm no mechanic, but even I could tell this wasn't good. I managed to limp along for another hour or so, the rattling growing louder with each passing mile. Just as the sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, I spotted a faded sign for a town called Millbrook, population 362. It wasn't much, but it was my best hope for finding a mechanic before nightfall. I never made it to Millbrook. About 5 miles outside of town, my car gave a final sputtering gasp and died. I coasted to the shoulder, a plume of smoke rising from under the hood. Cursing under my breath, I got out to survey the damage. The acrid smell of burning oil hit me as soon as I popped the hood. Even to my untrained eye, it was clear this was beyond a quick roadside fix. I reached for my phone only to find the battery completely drained. In my haste to get on the road that morning, I'd forgotten to plug it in. Panic started to set in as I looked around. Nothing but empty fields and darkening sky in every direction. The last car I'd seen had passed by over an hour ago. I was well and truly stranded. Just as I was contemplating whether to start walking towards town or hunker down in my car for the night, I heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. Relief flooded through me as I saw headlights approaching. The vehicle, an old pickup truck that had seen better days, slowed as it neared. The driver, a man who looked to be in his mid-40s, leaned out the window. "Car trouble," he called out, his voice friendly enough. I nodded, trying not to look as desperate as I felt. "Yeah, I think it's the engine. Any chance you know of a mechanic in town?" He smiled, and something about it made me uneasy. It didn't quite reach his eyes, which remained cold and assessing. "Well, you're in luck," he said. "I do a bit of mechanical work myself. Why don't I take a look?" Before I could respond, he was already out of his truck and heading towards my car. I watched as he peered under the hood, making thoughtful noises. "Oh yeah, I see the problem," he said after a minute. "Looks like your timing belt snapped. Took out a good chunk of your engine with it, I'm afraid." My heart sank. This was going to be expensive, I could tell. "Any chance of a quick fix to get me to town?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head. "No, I'm afraid this old girl isn't going anywhere under her own power. But tell you what, I can give you a tow into my shop in Millbrook. We can sort it out there. I hesitated. Every instinct was screaming at me not to get in a car with this stranger, but what choice did I have? It would be dark soon, and I couldn't very well spend the night out here. "That's really kind of you," I said, trying to sound grateful rather than apprehensive. "I really appreciate it." He waved off my thanks. "No trouble at all. Always happy to help a traveler in need. Name's John, by the way." "Sarah," I replied, shaking his offered hand. That's when I noticed it. As our palms met, I caught a glimpse of something dark caked under his fingernails and in the creases of his knuckles. At first, I thought it was grease or oil. He was a mechanic, after all. But as he pulled his hand away, I realized with a jolt of horror that it was blood. My mind raced. There could be innocent explanations, right? Maybe he'd cut himself working on a car earlier. Maybe he was a hunter and had been field dressing his kill. But the way his eyes glittered as he watched my reaction told me this was something far more sinister. I forced a smile, trying to act as if I hadn't noticed anything amiss. "So, shall we get started on that tow?" John nodded, turning back to his truck to fetch a tow cable. As soon as his back was turned, I made a split-second decision. I had to run. But before I could take more than a couple of steps, I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder. John's voice was low and dangerous in my ear. Now, Sarah. Let's not do anything foolish." I felt something sharp press against my side. A knife, I realized with growing terror. "Get in the truck," John said, his friendly demeanor gone. "And don't try anything stupid." With the knife at my back, I had no choice but to comply. As we pulled away, leaving my car behind, I watched the last traces of sunlight disappear from the horizon. The darkness that fell seemed to mirror the despair settling over me. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The knife remained pressed against my side, a constant reminder of the danger I was in. Finally, John turned off the main road onto a rutted dirt track. We bumped along for another few minutes before a dilapidated farmhouse came into view. My heart sank. This was no mechanic's shop. "Home sweet home," John said, his voice dripping with mockery. As we got out of the truck, I tried one last desperate plea. "Please," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "You don't have to do this. Just let me go, and I swear I won't tell anyone." John's laugh was cold and humorless. "Oh, Sarah, don't you know? No one ever leaves Millbrook." He marched me towards the house, the knife now openly visible in his blood-stained hand. As we neared the porch, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of muffled screams coming from inside. In that moment, I knew I had to act. It was now or never. Summoning every ounce of strength and courage I possessed, I drove my elbow back into John's solar plexus. He let out a grunt of pain and surprise, his grip on me loosening just enough. I bolted, running blindly into the darkness. I could hear John cursing behind me, his heavy footsteps in pursuit. But fear and adrenaline lent me speed I never knew I had. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally dared to look back, there was no sign of John. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran through cornfields and across muddy creeks. I ran until the first pale light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, and still, I ran. It was mid-morning when I finally stumbled onto a highway. A kind-faced woman in a minivan stopped to help, her eyes widening at my wild appearance and frantic story. She drove me straight to the sheriff's office in the next town over. The investigation that followed uncovered horrors beyond my worst nightmares. John wasn't just a killer. He was part of something larger, something that had been preying on unlucky travelers for years. They found my car, of course. The engine was fine. John had merely disconnected the battery to strand me there, a simple trick that had nearly cost me everything. It's been 6 months since that night, and I'm back home now. My dreams of carefree adventure have been replaced by nightmares of blood-stained hands and lonely roads. But I'm alive. I survived. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about those other victims, the ones who weren't as lucky as me, the ones whose screams I heard in that farmhouse, and I wonder how many others are out there waiting for help that may never come. So I tell my story, again and again, to anyone who will listen, because maybe, just maybe, it will save someone else from making the same mistakes I did, from trusting too easily, from ignoring their instincts. Because out there on the open road, freedom and danger often walk hand in hand, and sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under your bed. They're waiting by the side of the road, ready to offer you a helping hand. The first time I noticed something was amiss was when I found a single long black hair on my pillow. It wouldn't have been strange, except I'm blonde, and I was traveling alone. That's when I realized the nightmare had already begun, right here in the middle of paradise. My name is Emma, and this was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. A 2-week Caribbean cruise to celebrate my 30th birthday and my recent promotion. I'd saved for months, splurging on a balcony cabin with ocean views. The brochure had promised sun-drenched days, star-filled nights, and memories to last a lifetime. What it didn't mention was the terror that would keep me awake at night, wondering if I'd make it off this floating city alive. The cruise started off perfectly. I boarded the massive ship, the SS Oceanic Dream, with a sense of awe and excitement. My cabin was everything I'd hoped for, spacious, with a private balcony overlooking the sparkling Caribbean. I spent that first day exploring the ship, marveling at the multiple pools, the lavish restaurants, the bustling casino. It felt like I'd stepped into another world, one where my everyday worries couldn't touch me. That evening, I met my cabin neighbor, a friendly older woman named Margaret. She was a cruise veteran, regaling me with stories of her past voyages. We made plans to meet for breakfast the next morning, but Margaret never showed up for breakfast, or lunch, or dinner. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a big ship, after all, with plenty to do. Maybe she'd made other friends, or was sleeping off a late night at the casino. But as the days went by and I still hadn't seen her, a nagging worry began to grow in the pit of my stomach. On the third day, I decided to ask the cabin steward if he'd seen Margaret. His response sent a chill down my spine. "I'm sorry, miss," he said, looking confused. "But there's no one registered in the cabin next to yours. It's been empty this whole voyage." I insisted that he was mistaken, that I'd met Margaret, talked to her, but he just shook his head, a look of concern crossing his face. I could see him wondering if the sun and sea air had gotten to me. That night, I lay awake in my cabin, listening intently for any sound from next door. The walls on these ships were thin. I should have been able to hear something, but there was nothing but silence. Unable to sleep, I stepped out onto my balcony, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the cabin next door. A shadow passing behind the curtains. Someone was in there. My heart racing. I rushed to my cabin door, determined to knock on Margaret's door and get to the bottom of this. But as I reached for the handle, I froze. There, stuck to the outside of my door, was a Polaroid photo. It showed me sleeping in my bed, taken from inside my cabin. Panic seized me. Someone had been in my room while I slept. Someone was watching me. With trembling hands, I locked and bolted my door, then wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my cabin, jumping at every creak and groan of the ship. When morning finally came, I went straight to ship security. I showed them the photo, told them about Margaret, begged them to investigate. But the head of security, a stern-faced man named Johnson, seemed more annoyed than concerned. "Ma'am, we take the safety of our passengers very seriously," he said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "But we've checked the logs. The cabin next to yours is unoccupied. There is no passenger named Margaret on this cruise. As for the photo, well, are you sure you didn't take it yourself? Maybe as a joke?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They thought I was making this up, or worse, that I was crazy. Frustrated and scared, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, watching for anything out of the ordinary. And slowly, I began to notice things. Small things at first, easily overlooked. Like how certain crew members would exchange meaningful glances when they thought no one was looking, or how there always seemed to be someone lingering near my cabin, no matter the time of day. Then there were the disappearances. Not just Margaret. Other passengers I'd met and chatted with would suddenly vanish, with no explanation. When I asked about them, I was met with blank stares or insistence that no such person had ever been on board. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to take a walk around the ship. The decks were eerily quiet, most passengers long since retired to their cabins. As I rounded a corner, I saw a group of crew members huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their serious expression sent a shiver down my spine. As I turned to leave, my foot scuffed against the deck. The sound echoed in the quiet night, and the crew members' heads snapped up in unison. The look in their eyes as they spotted me. It wasn't surprise or embarrassment at being overheard. It was hunger. I ran. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, gaining on me quickly. I didn't dare look back, just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I made it back to my cabin and locked myself in, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. As my panic subsided, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Was I losing my mind? Or was something sinister really going on? The next day, I decided to try one last time to get help. I approached a group of passengers lounging by the pool, determined to make them understand the danger we were all in. But as I began to speak, I saw their eyes glaze over. Their smiles became fixed, artificial. And then, in perfect unison, they all stood up and walked away, leaving me standing alone by the empty pool. That's when I knew. Whatever was happening on this ship, it wasn't just a few crew members. It was everyone, or at least almost everyone. I spent the next few days in a state of constant vigilance, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. I stopped eating at the ship's restaurants, subsisting on snacks I brought from home. I trust no one. And then, 3 days before we were due to dock, I made a terrifying discovery. I was in my cabin, frantically searching for my passport. I'd decided I needed to be ready to run as soon as we reached port. As I rifled through my suitcase, my hand brushed against something hard and cold. It was a small, metal object. As I pulled it out, my blood ran cold. It was a set of surgical tools, crusted with what looked horribly like dried blood. I didn't put those there. I would never. But then, a flash of memory. The first night on the ship. The welcome cocktail that had tasted a bit off. The strange, dreamlike state I'd been in afterwards. What had I done? As I sat there, staring at the damning evidence in my hands, a knock came at my cabin door. "Housekeeping," a cheery voice called out. I didn't answer. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Miss Emma, we know you're in there. It's time for your treatment." Treatment? What treatment? I never signed up for any treatment. The door handle jiggled, once, twice. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a key card sliding into the lock. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed my emergency bag, the one I'd packed days ago when I first suspected something was wrong, and ran for the balcony. As the cabin door swung open behind me, I did the only thing I could think of. I jumped. The shock of the cold water jolted me back to reality. I surfaced, gasping for air, and looked up at the towering hull of the ship. I could see figures on my balcony pointing down at me. In the distance, I heard alarms begin to blare. I started swimming. I had no idea how far I was from land, or if I could even make it. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever fate awaited me in these waters, it couldn't be worse than what I was leaving behind. As I swam, the ship's lights grew dimmer. The last thing I heard before the waves swallowed all sound was a voice over the ship's PA system. "Attention passengers, we seem to have lost one of our own, but don't worry. On the SS Oceanic Dream, no one is ever truly lost. Sleep tight and sweet dreams." I don't know how long I swam. Hours, maybe days. My muscles screamed, my lungs burned. But finally, miraculously, I saw lights on the horizon, a coast, safety. As I dragged myself onto the beach, I knew my ordeal wasn't over. Who would believe my story? A ship full of people involved in what? Some kind of cult? A massive conspiracy? Even I wasn't sure I believed it. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, and I knew I had to warn others. So I'm telling my story now, to anyone who will listen, because somewhere out there, the SS Oceanic Dream is still sailing, still claiming passengers, and not everyone will be as lucky as I was. If you're planning a cruise, do me a favor. Double-check your itinerary, and if you see a ship called the Oceanic Dream, run. Run as fast as you can, because on that ship, the nightmare is all too real. The first time we saw the symbols carved into the trees, we laughed it off as some hiker's idea of a joke. By the time we realized the truth, we were already lost in a maze of ancient pines, with something watching us from the shadows, something that didn't want us to leave. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid hiker for most of my 28 years. I thought I'd seen it all: treacherous mountain paths, unexpected wildlife encounters, even the occasional rescue mission for less experienced trekkers. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the depths of Blackwood National Forest. It was supposed to be a routine weekend trip. My best friend Jake and I had been planning this hike for months, poring over maps and trail guides, eager to explore one of the most remote areas of the forest. We'd both grown up near Blackwood, but this particular region had always been off limits. Too dangerous, too easy to get lost in, the rangers said. But we were experienced, confident, maybe a little too confident, as it turned out. We set out early on a crisp Saturday morning, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The first few hours were everything we'd hoped for: challenging terrain, breathtaking views, and a sense of true wilderness that's hard to find these days. It was around midday when things started to feel off. "Hey, Alex," Jake called out, his voice tinged with confusion. Come check this out." I backtracked a few steps to where he was standing, staring at a massive old-growth pine. At first, I didn't see what had caught his attention. Then my eyes focused on a series of symbols carved deep into the bark. They weren't like any trail markers I'd ever seen. Intricate spirals and angular lines formed patterns that seemed to shift the longer I looked at them. It was unsettling, to say the least. "Weird," I muttered, running my fingers over the grooves. They felt older than they looked, the edges worn smooth by time. Probably just some bored kids playing around. Jake nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Yeah, probably. Let's keep moving." We pushed on, trying to shake off the strange feeling those symbols had left us with. But as the afternoon wore on, we started noticing more of them. Every few hundred yards, we'd spot another tree marked with those bizarre carvings. And something else was bothering me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't until Jake mentioned it that I realized what was wrong. "Alex," he said, his voice low and tense, "have you heard any birds lately, or anything?" I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. He was right. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of leaves under our boots. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, trying to keep the growing unease out of my voice. "We can always try this trail another day." Jake nodded eagerly, clearly as unsettled as I was. We consulted our map and GPS, plotting the quickest route back to the trailhead. But as we started to retrace our steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows deepened, despite it being early afternoon. And those symbols, they were everywhere now, carved into nearly every tree we passed. After an hour of increasingly panicked hiking, we had to face the truth. We were lost. "This is impossible," Jake muttered, frantically checking his GPS. "We should have hit the main trail by now. It's like the whole forest has changed." I was about to respond when a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We both whirled around, hearts pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the oppressive silence. "Is someone there?" No response. But I could have sworn I saw movement in the shadows between the trees, a flicker of something that didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. "We need to get out of here," Jake whispered, his face pale. "Now." We picked a direction and started walking, trying to move as quietly as possible while still covering ground quickly. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. As the light began to fade, panic set in. We were not equipped for a night in the forest, especially not whatever this place had become. Our flashlights cast eerie shadows as we pushed on, jumping at every rustle and crack in the darkness. That's when we heard it, a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It started as a low hum, almost below the threshold of hearing, but it grew louder, resolving into something that was almost like words. Almost, but not quite. It was as if the forest itself was trying to speak. Jake grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Tell me you hear that," he said, his voice shaking. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The not quite words seemed to be coming from all around us now, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my head spin. And then, cutting through the otherworldly sound, came a scream. A human scream, filled with terror and pain. It came from somewhere ahead of us, deeper in the forest. We stood frozen, caught between the instinct to run and the ingrained need to help someone in trouble. "We have to check it out," I said finally, hating myself even as the words left my mouth. "What if someone's hurt?" Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but nodded grimly. We moved forward slowly, every step feeling like we were walking deeper into a trap. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a heavy, anticipatory silence. We came to a small clearing, our flashlights illuminating a scene that defied explanation. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient tree. Its trunk was wider than any I'd ever seen, twisted and gnarled with age, and carved into every inch of its bark were those symbols, more intricate and alien than ever. But it was what was at the base of the tree that turned my blood to ice. A collection of objects that had no business being this deep in the wilderness. Watches, phones, wallets, dozens of them, arranged in a careful circle around the tree. Personal belongings, from other hikers. Other people who had wandered into this part of the forest and never made it out. "We need to go," Jake whispered, tugging at my sleeve. "Now, Alex, we need to go right now." I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the grisly display. As we turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something moving at the edge of the clearing. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, stepped out from behind a tree. It looked almost human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and its face, where its face should have been, was nothing but smooth, blank skin. A scream caught in my throat as more figures emerged from the darkness. 3, 5, a dozen of them, all with that same blank, featureless face. They began to move towards us with an unnatural grace, their not quite words growing louder. We ran. Branches whipped at our faces as we tore through the underbrush, blind panic driving us forward. I could hear them behind us, moving through the forest with inhuman speed. The symbols on the trees seemed to glow in the darkness, pulsing in time with the alien chant that filled the air. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmare forest. But suddenly, miraculously, we burst out onto a paved road. We didn't stop running until we reached Jake's car, parked at the trailhead. As we sped away, I looked back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw those blank faces watching us from between the trees. Then they were gone, and it was just a normal forest again. We drove straight to the ranger station, babbling our story to increasingly skeptical-looking officers. They searched the area we described but found nothing out of the ordinary. No symbols, no clearing, no evidence that anything strange had happened at all. Part of me wanted to believe we'd imagined it all. Some sort of shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and dehydration. But I know what I saw, what I felt. It's been 6 months since that day, and I haven't set foot in any forest since. Jake's the same way. We don't talk about what happened, but I can see the lingering fear in his eyes. The same fear I feel every time I look at the trees lining my suburban street and wonder what might be hiding behind them. I'm telling this story now as a warning. If you ever find yourself in Blackwood National Forest, or any wilderness really, and you start to notice strange symbols carved into the trees, don't dismiss them. Don't laugh them off like we did. Turn around. Get out while you still can. Because there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that live in the deep, dark places of the forest. Things that are always watching, always waiting for unwary travelers to wander just a little too far off the beaten path. And if you hear whispers in the woods that sound almost, but not quite, like words, run, run, and don't look back. Because in some forests, getting lost is the least of your worries. The scratching started on the second night. At first, I convinced myself it was just a raccoon or a curious bear. But when I unzipped the tent and came face to face with those glowing, inhuman eyes, I realized our family camping trip had become a fight for survival. I'm Mark, a 35-year-old software engineer from the suburbs of Seattle. My wife Sarah and I had decided it was time to introduce our kids, 10-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Ethan, to the great outdoors. We'd both grown up camping and wanted to share that experience with them. So we packed up our minivan with a tent, sleeping bags, and enough supplies for a long weekend in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. The first day was picture perfect. We found a secluded campsite near a babbling brook, set up our tent, and spent the afternoon hiking and identifying plants. Emma proved to be a natural, eagerly pointing out different types of trees and flowers. Ethan was more interested in skipping stones across the stream, but he seemed to be enjoying himself too. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The kids were enthralled by the star-filled sky, so different from what they could see back home. Sarah and I exchanged satisfied smiles. This was exactly what we'd hoped for. We all turned in early, tired from the day's activities, the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl lulled us to sleep. It was peaceful, perfect, until it wasn't. The scratching woke me sometime in the early hours of the morning. It was faint at first, barely audible over the nighttime forest sounds, but it was persistent, rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. I lay there for a while, listening. It seemed to be coming from the side of the tent. Probably just a curious animal, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But as the minutes ticked by, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could feel Sarah stirring beside me. "Mark," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me in the darkness. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Probably just a raccoon. I'll check it out." I fumbled for the flashlight we'd left by our sleeping bag and slowly unzipped the tent flap. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the surrounding trees. Nothing seemed out of place. The scratching had stopped as soon as I moved. I was about to zip the tent back up when I saw it. A flicker of movement just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. I swung the light in that direction, my heart suddenly pounding. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the light, but they were too high off the ground to be a raccoon, too large to be a deer, and the glow, it wasn't the normal reflection you'd see in an animal's eyes. It was an eerie, almost phosphorescent green. Then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined it. I quickly zipped the tent back up and tried to reassure Sarah. "Didn't see anything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just ran off when it heard me." She didn't seem entirely convinced, but we both eventually drifted back to sleep. The rest of the night passed without incident. The next day, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, looking for... what? I wasn't sure. The kids, oblivious to the night's disturbance, were having a blast. We spent the morning fishing in the stream, then went for another hike in the afternoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once, I thought I saw something moving just out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was never anything there. Sarah noticed my unease. "Everything okay?" she asked as we were preparing dinner. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just a bit tired, I guess. Didn't sleep great last night." She gave me a look that said she didn't quite believe me, but didn't press the issue. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Emma suddenly pointed into the darkness. "Dad, what's that?" I followed her gaze, my blood running cold. There, just beyond the circle of firelight, was a pair of glowing green eyes, the same ones I'd seen the night before. "Everyone in the tent. Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But Dad," Ethan started to protest. "Now," I repeated, more firmly this time. As Sarah ushered the kids into the tent, I grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it out in front of me like a weapon. The eyes had disappeared, but I could hear movement in the underbrush, something circling our campsite. I backed slowly towards the tent, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Just as I reached the tent flap, I heard a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. It raised the hair on the back of my neck. I practically dove into the tent, zipping it up securely behind me. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. The kids, picking up on our anxiety, huddled close. "What's going on, Dad?" Emma whispered. I took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to explain without terrifying them further. "There's something out there," I said finally. "Probably just a curious bear, but we need to stay in the tent, okay?" Ethan's lower lip trembled. "I'm scared." Sarah pulled him close. "It's okay, sweetie. We're safe in here." But even as she said it, the scratching started again, louder this time, more purposeful. It moved around the tent, as if whatever was out there was testing for weaknesses. We huddled together in the center of the tent, listening to the scratching and that occasional, bone-chilling growl. The kids whimpered softly, and I could feel Sarah trembling beside me. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the tent wall. Something large was right outside. We could hear it breathing, heavy, ragged breaths that didn't sound like any animal I knew. Then, a new sound. Sniffing. Long, deep inhalations. It was smelling us. The shadow moved, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to tear right through the tent fabric. But instead, it let out another low growl and moved away. We stayed frozen in place, barely daring to breathe. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Gradually, the normal sounds of the forest returned, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. The campsite looked normal in the early morning light, but as I stepped out, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tracks. Large, deep impressions in the soft earth around our tent. But they weren't bear tracks, or any other animal I recognized. They were almost like human footprints, but larger with long, curved claw marks at the end of each toe. And there, stuck to one of the tent poles, was a clump of coarse, dark hair. "We're leaving," I announced, my voice shaking slightly. Now, we packed up in record time, the kids unusually quiet and compliant. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. We never went back to that campsite. Never went camping again, actually. The kids were disappointed at first, but as they got older and we finally told them the full story of what happened that night, they understood. I've spent countless hours since then researching, trying to find an explanation for what we encountered. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, Wendigos, skinwalkers. Nothing quite fits. All I know is that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and civilization, we're not at the top of the food chain everywhere. So if you're planning a camping trip, especially in the Pacific Northwest, be careful, be aware, and if you hear scratching outside your tent in the middle of the night, if you see glowing green eyes in the darkness, don't convince yourself it's just your imagination. Because sometimes the monsters are real, and they're hungry,